I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. I think that's the part that still sits heavy with me, even now. Not the packing, not the early morning silence as I loaded boxes into my car, not even the way the apartment looked so small and temporary once everything that mattered was gone. It was the secrecy, the deliberate choice to disappear without explanation, without closure, without giving anyone the chance to ask me to stay. I left the key on the kitchen counter. That's all. No note. No forwarding address taped to the fridge. Just a silver key on white laminate, catching the first light of dawn through the window. I stood there for a moment, hand on the doorknob, and thought about writing something. Anything. But what was there to say that hadn't already been said in all the ways we'd stopped talking to each other? The drive was long. 3 hours of highway stretching out in front of me, familiar landmarks giving way to places I'd only seen on maps. I didn't put on music. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, and with every mile, I told myself I was doing the right thing. That distance was the same as healing. That a new city meant a new version of myself, one that didn't carry the weight of all the things I couldn't fix. The apartment I'd found online was small, a studio on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking. It had one window that looked out onto a side street I didn't know the name of. The landlord handed me the keys and told me trash day was Thursday. That was the extent of my welcome. I unpacked slowly, methodically, clothes in the closet, books on the shelf, coffee maker on the counter. I built routines out of nothing because routines felt like progress. Wake up, shower, work, lunch at the cafe 2 blocks over, work again, home, sleep, repeat. The job was fine. It wasn't what I wanted, but wanting things had gotten me into trouble before. It was stable, quiet, the kind of place where no one asked personal questions, where you could disappear into spreadsheets and conference calls and the low hum of fluorescent lights. I was good at disappearing by then. Days turned into weeks. The quiet didn't hurt as much as it used to. Or maybe I just got better at not noticing the hurt. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. Stopped drafting texts I'd never sent. Stopped wondering if he noticed I was gone, or if my absence just filled in like water around stone, smooth and inevitable. I found a cafe I liked. It wasn't special. The coffee was average, the pastries were dry, but it had a corner table by the window where I could sit during my lunch break and watch the street without anyone bothering me. I brought a book sometimes, though I rarely read it. Mostly I just sat there, letting the noise of strangers wash over me, pretending I was the kind of person who could be alone without it meaning something. It was a gray afternoon when it happened. The kind of day where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or just threaten to, so it does both. I was at my usual table, watching droplets race each other down the glass, when I saw the reflection. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that the exhaustion and the loneliness had finally caught up to me, and my mind was playing tricks. Because it couldn't be him. He didn't know where I was. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. But there he was, standing on the sidewalk outside, hands in his jacket pockets, looking directly at me through the window. Jonah, my breath caught, like something physical lodged itself in my chest and refused to move. The cafe noise fell away. The woman at the counter calling out orders. The hiss of the espresso machine. The scrape of chairs on tile. All of it dissolved into silence, and there was only him. Only the ghost I'd driven 3 hours to escape, standing in the rain, looking at me like he'd been searching for months and finally found what he was looking for. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stood there waiting. I should have looked away, should have gathered my things and walked out the back exit, should have kept running the way I'd been running since the night I decided leaving was easier than staying. But I couldn't move. I was frozen there, coffee going cold in my hands, watching him watch me, and feeling every carefully constructed wall I'd built in this new city crumble with a single breath. Because I'd been lying to myself. All of it had been a lie. The clean start, the moving on, the belief that distance could do what time and silence couldn't. I thought putting miles between us would make the missing stop, that I could pack up the life we almost had and leave it behind like furniture I didn't need anymore. But standing there, staring at his reflection in the rain-streaked glass, I understood something I'd been too afraid to admit before. I'd never stopped. Not for a single day. Not for a single hour. And now he was here. In the city I'd chosen specifically because it wasn't anywhere he would be. In front of the cafe I'd claimed as my sanctuary. Looking at me with those same eyes that used to undo me, that made me feel seen in ways that terrified me. The rain picked up. He didn't move. Neither did I. I was 23 when I left. 23 and convinced that control was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. That if I could just manage my life the way I managed everything else, carefully and quietly, then maybe I could survive the fact that loving Jonah had felt like standing too close to a fire. My name is Reese. I've always been the careful one. The one who thinks 3 steps ahead, who weighs consequences, who builds safety nets out of silence and distance. My friends used to joke that I planned my spontaneity. They weren't wrong. There's a comfort in knowing what comes next, in controlling the variables, in making sure nothing catches you off guard. Jonah was every variable I couldn't control. We met 2 years before I left, at a gallery opening neither of us particularly wanted to be at. I was there because my coworker needed a buffer. He was there because his roommate was exhibiting. We ended up standing in front of the same painting, some abstract piece that was supposed to represent urban isolation, and he said it looked like a sunset having a nervous breakdown. I laughed before I could stop myself. He turned and smiled at me like he'd just won something. That was Jonah, 24 years old and utterly unafraid of his own intensity. Where I measure my words, he spilled his. Where I held back, he leaned in. He was impulsive in ways that made me anxious and alive in ways that made me envious. He laughed too loud in quiet restaurants. He cried during commercials. He loved without conditions, without exits, without the careful negotiations I thought all relationships required. For a while it worked. He pulled me out of my routines, and I gave him something steady to come home to. We balanced each other, or at least I told myself we did. He'd show up at my apartment at midnight with takeout and terrible movie suggestions. I'd remind him about bills and appointments and all the small practical things he forgot when he was busy feeling everything at once. But balance only works when both people are trying to meet in the middle. The breakup wasn't a single moment. It was erosion, a series of small disappointments that built up like sediment until we couldn't see each other clearly anymore. He wanted promises I didn't know how to make. Commitment that felt less like love and more like being trapped. He'd ask me where I saw us in 5 years, and I'd deflect, change the subject, suggest we focus on now instead of then. He started asking less. I started staying later at work. We stopped fighting because we stopped talking about anything that mattered. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was resigned, like we'd both decided that caring hurt more than not caring, so we'd just stop. I told myself it was mutual, that we'd grown apart naturally, the way people do. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. I was scared. Scared of how much he needed. Scared of how much I wanted to give him. Scared that if I let myself love him the way he loved me, I'd lose myself completely. So I left. Took a job I found online, in a city I'd only visited once. An office position that was lateral at best, a step backward if I was being honest. But it was far enough away that I wouldn't run into him at the grocery store. Far enough that I could pretend I was starting over instead of just running away. The new city was gray and unfamiliar in all the ways I needed it to be. No shared memories on street corners. No restaurants we'd fought in or parks where we'd reconciled. Just buildings and strangers and the clean slate I'd convinced myself I wanted. I built a life out of absence. Work became the center because work didn't ask questions. I had coworkers but not friends. Routines but not plans. I told myself this was healing. That the emptiness was just space I needed to figure out who I was without him. But late at night, in that small studio apartment with its single window and its unfamiliar shadows, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, drafting messages I'd never sent, wondering if he noticed I was gone or if my leaving had just confirmed what he'd already suspected, that I was never really all in to begin with. I deleted his number, but I still knew it by heart. I'd unfollowed him on everything, but I still found myself typing his name into search bars at 2 in the morning, just to see proof that he still existed somewhere out there, living a life that no longer included me. The guilt was constant, not sharp, just a low, steady ache I carried everywhere. Because I knew what I'd done. I'd left without explanation, without giving him the chance to fight for us, or to let me go properly. I'd chosen the coward's way out, and some part of me knew I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if that made me practical or just broken. And then he showed up outside that cafe window, and every lie I'd told myself about moving on shattered like glass. I set my coffee down carefully, though my hand was shaking. Stood up, walked to the cafe door like I was moving through water, everything slow and thick and inevitable. The bell chimed as I pushed it open. The rain was lighter now, just a mist that hung in the air without really falling. Jonah stood exactly where he'd been, hands still in his pockets, watching me step outside like he'd been waiting for this moment since the day I disappeared. Up close, he looked different. Tired maybe. There were shadows under his eyes I didn't remember, and his hair was longer, curling slightly at his collar. But his expression was the same. That careful openness he always had, like he was offering something fragile and hoping you wouldn't break it. I stopped a few feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to run if I needed to. "You shouldn't be here," I said. The words came out harsher than I meant them to. Defensive, like I was angry at him for showing up when really I was angry at myself for being glad he did. He smiled, that same uneven grin that used to undo me, the one that tilted higher on the left side and made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "You said you wanted space. I gave you space. Now I want to fill it." It was such a Jonah thing to say, bold and earnest and completely without guile. Like he'd practiced it in the car on the way here and decided it was both profound and charming. Under different circumstances, I might have laughed. Instead, I sighed. "You drove 3 hours just to say that." He shook his head slowly, rain misting his hair. "I drove here because I finally figured out what I should have said before you left." Something in my chest tightened. I wanted to ask what that was. Wanted to demand he explain how he'd found me, why he thought showing up unannounced was acceptable, what gave him the right to dismantle the fragile peace I'd built in this anonymous city. But I didn't ask any of it, because part of me already knew. Part of me had been waiting for this since the moment I left that key on the counter. His hand moved, slipped into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed something there, something small that made a soft metallic sound against the fabric. I saw the shift in his expression, the brief flicker of vulnerability before he steadied himself. But he didn't pull it out, just left his hand there, touching whatever it was like a talisman. I should have walked away then. Should have told him this was a mistake, that he needed to go home, that I'd left for a reason and nothing had changed. But the words wouldn't come. I just stood there in the mist, looking at him, feeling the weight of all the things we'd never said pressing down between us. "Come get dinner with me," he said quietly. "Just dinner. You can tell me to leave after. I'll listen this time." That last part hit harder than it should have. "I'll listen this time." An acknowledgement of all the times he hadn't. All the times his intensity had drowned out my hesitation, when his certainty had steamrolled over my doubts. I told him I needed to think about it. He nodded, gave me the name of his hotel, said he'd be there for a few days. Said it was just a visit, though we both knew that was a lie. You don't drive 3 hours for a visit. You don't track someone down in a city they specifically chose to escape you unless you're looking for something more permanent than dinner. Then he walked away. Didn't push. Didn't beg. Just turned and headed down the street. Hands back in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the rain. I watched him go until he turned the corner. Then I went back inside the cafe, sat down at my table, and stared at my cold coffee for 20 minutes without moving. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my head. His smile, his voice, the way his hand had moved to his pocket and stayed there. What was he carrying? Why hadn't he shown me? At 2 a.m, I sent him a text. Just 2 words. "Tomorrow, 7. He responded immediately, like he'd been awake too, like he'd been waiting. The restaurant name came through, followed by a second message. "Thank you for giving me a chance." I didn't respond to that. Just set my phone down and stared at the ceiling, wondering what I'd just agreed to. Wondering if I was being brave or just repeating the same mistakes with better lighting. Because the truth was, I never stopped wanting him. I just convinced myself that wanting something and being able to keep it were different things. That loving Jonah meant losing myself, and losing myself meant disappearing completely. But he'd found me anyway, tracked me down in the one place I thought I'd be safe from him. And now he was asking for dinner. Just dinner. Like it was simple. Like we could sit across from each other and pretend the last 3 months hadn't happened. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine it. His face across the table. The sound of his voice. The way he'd look at me like I was the only person in the room. And despite everything, despite all my careful planning and distance and control, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Dinner turned into 3 days. I didn't plan it that way. Neither did he, or at least that's what he claimed. But after that first night, when we sat across from each other at a restaurant neither of us really noticed and talked until the staff started stacking chairs, something shifted. Not back to how it was, into something different, something quieter and more uncertain, but also more honest than we'd ever been. He showed up at the cafe the next day during my lunch break. Didn't ask if he could join me. Just sat down across from my usual table by the window and ordered black coffee the way he always did, too bitter for anyone sensible to enjoy. I should have told him not to come back. Should have established boundaries. But instead I heard myself asking what he'd done that morning, and he told me about the bookstore he'd found 3 blocks over, the one with the cat that sits in the window and judges passersby. We talked about books, about the weather, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. The third day, he walked me home from work. I didn't ask him to. He was just there when I left the building, leaning against the lamppost across the street like he had every right to be part of my routine now. We walked in silence for the first few blocks, and then he started talking. About the city, about how different it felt from home, about the small details he'd noticed, the way the light hit the buildings at dusk, the sound of traffic that never quite stopped. It was easier than I expected, having him there. Easier and harder at the same time, because every moment felt borrowed. Every conversation felt like it was building towards something I wasn't ready to name. We didn't talk about the breakup. We didn't talk about why I left or how he found me. We circled around the truth like it was something too heavy to pick up yet, too sharp to touch without bleeding. Instead, we talked about movies. He told me about the ones he'd watched alone in his apartment after I left. The terrible action films he used as white noise. I told him about the book I'd been trying to read for 2 months and couldn't seem to finish. We talked about his job, the graphic design work that paid the bills but never quite felt like enough. About my job, the spreadsheets and conference calls that made me feel productive and empty at the same time. One evening, we ended up at a park near my apartment. There was a bench overlooking a pond, ducks swimming in lazy circles while the sun set behind the buildings. We sat there as the light faded, not quite touching, the space between us feeling both vast and paper-thin. He asked me if I was happy here. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unexpected, but because I didn't know how to answer it honestly. Was I happy? I was surviving. I was functioning. I'd built a life that didn't hurt as much as the one I'd left behind. But happy. I told him I was getting used to it. That was quiet. That quiet was what I needed. He nodded slowly, like he understood, like he wasn't going to push. Then he said something that made my breath catch. You left thinking I stopped loving you. I came to make sure you know I didn't. His voice was soft, steady, not pleading or desperate, just factual, like he was correcting a misunderstanding, clarifying something I'd gotten wrong. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I'd left because I loved him too much, not too little. That the problem was never his feelings, but mine, the way they terrified me, the way loving him felt like standing on the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. But I didn't say any of that. I just sat there, watching the ducks, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. The tremor in my breath gave me away. I felt it happen, felt the way my chest tightened and my eyes burned, and I knew he heard it too. But he didn't make a thing of it. Didn't try to comfort me or push for more. Just sat there beside me while the sun disappeared and the streetlights flickered on one by one. When we finally stood to leave, his hand brushed mine. Accidental or intentional, I couldn't tell. But for a moment, just a moment, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to close my fingers around his. To stop running. To admit that the distance I'd built was just another form of hiding. We walked back to my apartment in silence. When we reached my building, he didn't try to come up. Just told me he'd see me tomorrow if that was okay. I said it was. He smiled, that uneven smile again, the one that made me feel like I was 19 and falling for him all over again. Then he turned and walked toward his hotel, hands in his pockets. And I stood there watching him go, wondering how much longer I could pretend that having him here wasn't exactly what I wanted. That night, lying in bed, I thought about what he'd said, about coming here to make sure I knew he didn't stop loving me, about the way he'd been showing up day after day without demanding anything, without making grand speeches or pushing for answers I wasn't ready to give. He was trying, not with words, but with presence. And maybe that was the difference between now and before. Maybe that was what had changed. It happened on a Sunday morning. The kind of quiet Sunday where the city feels half asleep, where even the traffic sounds muted and the light comes through the windows softer than usual. I was making coffee when I heard the knock. Not the buzzer from downstairs, which meant he'd waited for someone to let him into the building. Just a soft knock on my door, hesitant in a way that made my heart clench. I opened it already knowing who I'd find. Jonas stood there in the hallway, hair damp from rain I hadn't realized was falling. He looked tired, not just physically tired, but the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. His jacket was dark with water at the shoulders. His eyes held mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He didn't say hello, didn't apologize for showing up unannounced again, just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out, a small box, navy blue, worn at the edges like it had been carried around for a while, held in hands that couldn't quite decide whether to keep it hidden or finally let it see light. My breath stopped. He looked down at the box in his palm, then back up at me. "I bought this a week before you left," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but I could hear the fracture underneath. "I thought it would fix everything. Turns out, I was the one who needed fixing." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Just stood there in my doorway while the coffee maker beeped behind me. Some mundane sound from a normal morning that suddenly felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. Jonah took a breath. "I spent 3 months trying to figure out why you left. Kept replaying everything, looking for the moment I ruined it. I thought maybe I loved you too loud, needed too much, scared you away with how certain I was about us." He paused, fingers tightening around the box. "But then I realized something. You didn't leave because I loved you wrong. You left because I never asked what you needed. I just assumed, pushed, made promises without checking if they were promises you wanted to hear." The words hit me like physical things. Because he was right. He'd always been so sure about us, so confident in where we were heading, and I'd felt like I was drowning in that certainty. Like his vision of our future was so bright and solid that there was no room for my doubt, my fear, my need to move slower. Jonah stepped closer, not into my apartment, just closer to the threshold. "You don't have to take it," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Just know that I came here to try." For once, I didn't run. I didn't assume. I drove 3 hours and I waited. I let you set the pace. I gave you space when you needed it, and I showed up when you let me. He held out the box. My hand was shaking as I took it. The velvet was soft under my fingers, worn smooth in places from being held. I opened it slowly, feeling like I was defusing something that might explode. Inside wasn't a diamond. Wasn't some grand statement piece meant to announce commitment to the world. It was simple, silver, understated, the kind of ring you wear every day, not to show off, but to remember. A thin band with a small inscription on the inside that I had to tilt toward the light to read. 2 words, worth trying. I felt something break open in my chest, something I've been holding closed for months, maybe longer. My vision blurred, and I had to blink hard to clear it. "You kept it," I whispered. Jonah's answer came soft. I never stopped meaning it. I looked up at him, really looked at him, at the hope and fear written equally across his face, at the way he was standing there, completely vulnerable, offering me something he'd been carrying since before I left, before I'd made the choice to run, when he'd still believed we could work. He bought this ring thinking it would fix us. And then instead of giving it to me, instead of making some grand gesture that would have felt like pressure, like one more promise I wasn't ready for, he'd held on to it, carried it with him, kept it even after I disappeared. And then he'd driven 3 hours to find me. Not to demand I come back. Not to guilt me or beg. Just to show me that he'd changed. That he'd learned. That he was willing to do the work he should have done before. I don't know how long we stood there. Him in the hallway, me in the doorway, the box open between us. The rain picked up outside, drumming against the windows. My coffee was probably cold by now. Finally, I found my voice. Come inside. He hesitated. Are you sure? I stepped back, holding the door open wider. I'm sure. He walked in slowly, carefully, like he was afraid sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing we were building. I closed the door behind him, and we stood there in my small apartment, the space that was supposed to be my escape, my fresh start. And for the first time since I'd arrived in this city, it felt like something other than a hiding place. It felt like a beginning. We spent that Sunday together, not talking about the ring, not talking about what came next, just existing in the same space, relearning how to be near each other without all the weight we used to carry. He helped me make breakfast, even though neither of us was particularly hungry. We moved around my small kitchen in a careful dance, passing each other the butter and the coffee mugs and all the small domestic things that used to feel suffocating but now felt like relief, like proof that we could do this differently. I asked him how long he was planning to stay. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me over his coffee cup, those dark eyes searching mine for something. As long as you'll let me, he finally said, or until you tell me to go, whichever comes first. It wasn't a demand, wasn't pressure, just honesty, and maybe that was what undid me. The fact that he was giving me the choice, giving me control over something I'd never felt in control of before. That afternoon, he went back to his hotel to check out. Said there was no point paying for a room he wasn't using. I didn't ask where he planned to stay instead. Didn't offer my couch. We weren't there yet. But the unspoken possibility hung between us like a question neither of us was brave enough to voice. The week that followed felt suspended, like we were existing in some pocket of time that wasn't quite real, where the rules of our old relationship didn't apply, but the rules of something new hadn't been written yet. He found a coffee shop where he could work on his laptop. Started taking on freelance project again. The design work he'd let slip when everything fell apart. I went to my office job and came home to find him at that same cafe by the window, the one where I'd first seen his reflection. We fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Some nights he walked me home and kept walking. Some nights he came upstairs and we watched movies on my couch, careful not to sit too close, careful not to assume. The ring stayed in its box on my bookshelf. I didn't put it on, didn't put it away either. Just let it exist there, a reminder of the choice I hadn't made yet. We talked more than we ever had before. Real conversations, not just the surface pleasantries we'd hidden behind when things were falling apart. He told me about the therapy he'd started after I left, about the things he'd learned about himself, the patterns he'd recognized, how he'd always equated love with intensity, thought that if he wasn't burning bright enough, he wasn't loving hard enough. I told him about the guilt, about the nights I'd spent staring at my phone, wanting to call him and not knowing what I'd say, about how leaving felt like survival, but also like cowardice, and I still wasn't sure which one it actually was. He listened without trying to fix it. That was new too. The listening, the letting me sit in my mess without rushing to clean it up. But there was still distance, still that gap between us that neither of us knew how to close. We'd been careful for so long, so deliberate about not pushing, that neither of us knew how to take the next step. Until one night, standing outside his hotel in the rain, I finally broke. It was late, past midnight. We'd spent the evening walking through the city, not really going anywhere, just moving. When we ended up outside his hotel, he turned to say good night, and I felt something crack open inside me. All the careful control I'd been maintaining, all the measured distance, it just shattered. You don't get to leave this time, I said. My voice was shaking, angry and desperate and terrified all at once. He stared at me, rain running down his face, eyes wide. I stepped closer. If we're doing this, if we're really trying, then you don't get to leave when it gets hard, when I'm difficult, when I need space, or when I shut down, or when I'm scared. You don't get to leave. The words were tumbling out now, years of fear and hurt and want pouring out in the middle of the rain. Because I left, I continued. I ran because I was terrified and I didn't know how to tell you that your certainty made me feel like I was disappearing. And I'm still terrified, but I don't want to run anymore. So if we do this, you have to promise me you'll stay. Even when it's not easy, even when I'm not easy. Jonah's eyes were bright. Rain or tears, I couldn't tell. Then you don't either, he said quietly. What? You don't get to leave either. You don't get to run the next time you're scared. You don't get to pack up in the middle of the night and disappear. You have to stay too. His voice was steady, certain, but not the old certainty that used to overwhelm me. This was different. This was a promise made by someone who'd learned what it cost to be wrong. I stepped forward, close enough that the rain falling on us felt like it was falling on a single person instead of two. Close enough to see the way his breath caught, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. When our foreheads touched, it felt like forgiveness without words. Like absolution. Like coming home to a place that had been rebuilt from the ground up, stronger and stranger and more honest than it ever was before. Deal, I whispered. He smiled against my skin. Deal. And then, finally, we closed the distance we'd been maintaining for weeks. Not rushing. Not desperate. Just certain. Just choosing each other deliberately and completely in the rain. Months passed. Not the heavy, suffocating kind of time that drags when you're trying to forget someone. The other kind. The kind that moves gently, that builds something steady without you noticing until you look up one day and realize everything has changed. Jonah's things filled the corners of my apartment gradually. First just a toothbrush, then a drawer, then half the closet. His sneakers appear by the door, always unlaced and kicked off carelessly. His coffee mugs cluttered the counter, mismatched and chipped from years of use. His sketchbooks stacked up on the side table, filled with designs and doodles and absent-minded drawings he made while thinking. The apartment stopped feeling like a hiding place. Stopped feeling temporary. It became ours in ways I'd never let anything be ours before. We fought sometimes. Not the silent, festering kind of fighting we used to do, where resentment built up like water behind a dam until something burst. Real fights. Loud ones occasionally. About dishes and schedules, and the fact that he still sometimes made plans without asking, and I still sometimes shut down instead of speaking up. But we learned how to come back from them. How to sit down after and say the things we should have said the first time. How to apologize without making excuses. How to mean it when we said we'd try harder. He got better at asking what I needed instead of assuming. I got better at telling him instead of expecting him to read my mind. We got better at being two separate people who chose to build something together, instead of two people trying to merge into one and losing themselves in the process. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. I came home from work one evening in early spring to find him sitting on the couch, the navy blue box balanced on his knee. He'd been doing that more lately, taking it out, looking at it, not saying anything, just holding it like he was working up the courage for something. The ring was still inside. I'd never put it on, never asked him why he kept taking it out and putting it away again. We existed in this strange space where we were together but not engaged, committed but without the symbol, building a life that felt real but somehow incomplete. He looked up when I walked in, saw my bag down by the door, kicked off my shoes next to his. You never did give me an answer, he said quietly. My heart stuttered. I knew what he meant. The ring. The question that had been sitting between us since that rainy Sunday morning months ago. The promise we'd made to each other, but never made official. I moved to sit beside him on the couch, close enough that our knees touched, close enough to see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that after everything, I might still say no. I think you already knew, I said softly. He shook his head slightly, just wanted to hear it anyway. And I understood then that he needed the words. That after everything we'd been through, after all the silence and assumptions and misunderstandings, he needed me to say it out loud, to choose him deliberately, to make it real. I took the box from his hands, opened it. The silver ring caught the light from the window, simple and honest and exactly right. I slipped it on my fingers slowly, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, just present. A reminder every time I looked down that I'd made a choice and chosen to keep making it. Yes, I said. The word came out steady. Sure, I'm saying yes. Jonah's eyes glimmered. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing my cheek. I leaned into the touch, into the warmth of him, into the certainty that used to terrify me and now just felt like home. I kissed him. Slow. Certain. Not like the desperate kisses we'd shared when everything was falling apart. Not like the careful ones we'd exchanged when we were first rebuilding. This was different. This was the kiss of two people who'd found their way back to each other through honesty and patience and a willingness to do the work. When we pulled apart, he was smiling. That uneven grin that still undid me after all this time. We sat there as the light faded outside, his head on my shoulder, my hand in his, the ring warm on my finger. Not talking, not needing to, just existing together in the quiet we'd built, the kind of quiet that didn't hurt anymore. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one against the windows. The same city lights I'd watched alone for months, trying to convince myself I was better off in this anonymous place where no one knew my name or my history. The place that was supposed to be an escape had become something else entirely. Not the city where I ran from Jonah. Not the city where I tried to forget what we'd been. But the city where Jonah found me again. Where we found each other again. Where we learned how to love each other better than we had before. I looked down at the ring on my finger. At Jonah's hand wrapped around mine. At the life we'd built in this small apartment with its single window and its worn carpet and its mismatched coffee mugs. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when I left. It wasn't the clean break or the fresh start or the person I thought I'd become. It was better. It was real. It was ours.